It's been more than a couple of years since I moved to Portugal, and here are some of my thoughts of what it is like to live in this country. I'm Rafael Di Furia. Welcome to another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, and roll that intro. In episode 345, I talked a little bit about working in Portugal, my thoughts after 2 years here in the country. And actually, it's about 2.5 years since I moved to Portugal. There's a lot that's happened in this time, and I can say that in many ways, I do really enjoy living here. I've made some amazing friends. I've had some wonderful experiences. And there are some amazing things that really have made me more and more think of this country as home. But like any place, of course, as I've said many times, I'm never going to say one place is absolutely perfect for anybody. And one of the first things, though, that I want to get into in this episode is that many people think about moving to Europe with the intention of using it as a jump-off point for being able to travel around Europe and even beyond that. And one of the unfortunate aspects of living in this country is that unless you're living around some place where you would have access to the Lisbon airport, or what might be called in the future one of the airports in Lisbon, is that getting around Europe, at least to many of the destinations that I would be interested in or would have to go to for work, I would say, for me, actually are a lot less convenient than many other locations around Europe. Of course, it's about as far west as you can get when it comes to airports in the European continent. If you are trying to make it to certain destinations that would otherwise have maybe daily flights from many other locations within Europe, or even multiple flights per day, you find that your options become a bit more limited. And if you only need to go for an overnight stay for a meeting, or if you need to go for just a quick weekend, maybe that quick weekend would have to turn into a week because maybe there's only one flight there and one flight coming back each week, or 2 per week, depending on where you're trying to go. Of course, we're not talking about small municipal airports here. I actually will say that I do quite like the Porto airport. It's a good size. It's not too big, not too small. It has a lot of options of places where you can go to. And so part of that Europe experience that many people are looking for is a little bit more difficult to do from here. Still very doable because you're on the European continent. But I will say, talking about the European experience, there are times that I have to remind myself that, oh yeah, Portugal is in Europe, because there are some parts of Portugal that you can spend time in and not necessarily feel like you're in anywhere specific, that you're like actually in Portugal or you're in Europe. New high-rise buildings that have no real character to them, that you don't know exactly where you could be. You could be even somewhere in the US. Granted, the architecture is quite different, but there's nothing that tells me sometimes, oh, look at where you are, other than maybe the Portuguese sidewalks. Although if you are in the center of a city, then okay, yes, you'll have more of that feeling of being in a European location, of course. And granted, after a number of years, maybe I've just become desensitized to some of these things. And just before we get to the next section, I do want to say a huge thank you to those of you who help to make these episodes possible on the monthly basis, or the thanks button. Of course, all of the links are in the more info section below this episode. And also a huge thank you to those of you who are subscribed and who like and share these episodes with your friends. It really all does help the channel to be able to continue. So on the idea of continuing, let's get into the next topic. In comparison with other locations that I've spent time in around Europe, there are times that I really am walking around here and think, oh, right, yeah, I'm in Europe, because I'll look at something, I'll look at a specific place and think, oh, right, that's Europe that I'm living in. But even though there are times that I would say it might be easy for me to forget that aspect, that it's still a very different experience than what you might experience in another part of the world, especially if you're from the US. And coming from the US and coming from a country like the US, you will have a very different lifestyle in front of you. Portugal has its own flavor, its own unique way of going through life on a day-to-day basis. For some people, some of those aspects become a bit tedious and difficult to deal with, because things might not happen in such an organized way that it might happen in another part of the world, or even another part of Europe. But as I've mentioned in many episodes, having moved here from Italy, there are certain aspects of just the bureaucratic system here that are a lot easier to deal with. But then there are other things within the bureaucracy here that are a lot less fun to deal with. But on a day-to-day basis, there are things you might notice here and there. But is it going to get in the way? Generally speaking, not so much. But if you are dealing with certain things about getting life started, or rentals, or purchasing a property, or whatever it may be, of course you're going to feel those things more, because that's where bureaucracy actually comes into play. But of course, those aspects of life are not why people move to a country. And some of the wonderful things about the lifestyle here, and being able to enjoy your time, not living to work, but working to live, and having the ability to enjoy your time, and to be able to take time to be happy and live in the world around you. Those things are really wonderful to be able to experience. But one problem that I would say for me that I've noticed in Portugal, especially having seen what Portugal was a number of years ago, there's an over-commercialization that is not unique to Portugal that I've seen here, I've seen in Italy, and I've seen in other countries, that sometimes you almost could be in any European city at some points. I know I just did say a few minutes ago that sometimes I do forget that you're in Europe, but there is this touristy European feeling that I can't necessarily put into words, that you could literally be almost in any town, any city, any place, any tourist center, and not necessarily feel like it's so different from the next touristy spot. The magnets that you see being sold on the sides of the street, a lot of them are all made in the same factory. And so even though, yes, you'll have a different experience in some ways, it's sometimes when I'm traveling through Europe, I get this feeling that, okay, yeah, it's all kind of becoming this one thing. But I know, having even also spoken with people who are a bit older than I am and traveled Europe many years ago, I've heard the same complaint that when you used to travel around Europe and go from place to place, that each location would have its own distinct feeling. You would only be able to find this one little knick-knack from here, or this one little food, or this one thing that you could only buy in this specific location or only experience in that specific location. But now, some of these experiences, for lack of a better word, seem to be replicated around the continent. And so if you're looking for that vacation feeling, that holiday feeling, is Portugal the place that you really need to experience them in? Are there other places that are maybe more enjoyable, less enjoyable, or that are more livable? That's a question that can only be answered by an individual person after they've had their own experiences and been able to make up their own minds about what they've experienced in these places. And this for me is one major aspect. If I move to a place, I want to experience the place. I don't want to necessarily feel like I am living in another culture's version of what that place has to offer. However, I will say in Portugal, there are some aspects of this that can actually be enjoyable sometimes. Like, for example, you find actually quite a bit of Brazilian influence around the country nowadays. It wasn't necessarily always like this, but I mean, especially in a place like Braga, aka Bragazil, you can find Brazilian food and have Brazilian experiences here in Portugal. So it is nice to be able to feel like you can have a little mini vacation just going down the block or to the other side of town, rather than having to travel to the other side of the world. But to experience what I would call the real Portugal, I feel as though you really have to search that out. And yes, you can have very Portuguese experiences in downtown areas and in cities, but what I think of as quintessentially Portugal seems as though you really kind of have to look for it a bit more than you used to in the past. Of course, I could talk a bit more about the cost of living here in Portugal, but I did talk about that quite a bit recently, so I'd advise checking out episode 347. But now, having been here in Portugal almost 2.5 years, I'm at the point now where my rental contract is getting close to a potential end. So I'm thinking, well, are they going to try to increase it? Or am I going to get lucky and they're going to keep it at the same price? What's going to happen with this contract that I have for where I currently live? So, of course, I have to keep all options open and available to me. I would much prefer to stay in my current apartment, but I've also been looking at backup options. And even when I came here, finding an apartment was very, very difficult, but it has seemed to become even more difficult to find not only an apartment, but an apartment that's in a maybe location that's a little bit more interesting to call home. I wouldn't say that the current location of where I live is perfect, but I do like it. I'm not going to talk about where I live exactly, other than just within the city that I live in, Braga. But when I'm talking about even looking at other places, the costs have gone up by such a huge amount that it really does leave me wondering, what is the value of remaining here? What is the value of calling this city home? Of course, many of you know that I came here for family and to kind of keep an eye out on things for them. And especially as time goes on and having to look at the potential of being able to stay in my current apartment versus having to potentially relocate, what would that look like? What options are available to me? So I have to explore those things. And when trying to even find a place in this country, it's so difficult that I would say, not just for the people who are already here, but for the people who are coming, is it really worthwhile thinking about? Maybe if you've never been to Portugal and you haven't dealt with like being here before, that there are things like this that get in the way of maybe creating a more enjoyable experience where you can have some of that security of knowing what your rent might even look like, or what your housing opportunities will even look like. Because if you see anywhere in the world, of course, the cost of living has gone up significantly with inflation over the last years and other problems, of course. But in a country like Portugal, where it's gone up by such a drastic amount, I would say even in comparison to some other parts of the world, think about it, really think about it. And don't think about, hey, I'm moving to another country and I'm going to arrive there. It's going to be great. And then I'll see what happens later. You want to have a bit of an idea of what things could look like on a little bit of a longer term basis. Of course, though, with the times that we're living in, planning out in the distant future, I would say, has become a bit more tricky than it might have been in past years, but it's still to an extent doable, and keeping certain things in mind, of course. Of course, one of the big things would be the language barrier. I was fortunate that when I came to Portugal, I already had a little bit of Portuguese under my belt and could get some basic things done. My Portuguese still isn't perfect, but it has improved significantly. But I can say that I do know people who have been living here even for a little bit longer than I've been living here, and the level of their ability to use the local language has not necessarily improved since I've met some of them when I first moved here. And I'll admit at times I'm actually a bit surprised how little Portuguese you might need to be able to get around on a day-to-day basis. I mean, granted, there will be bigger things, especially when dealing with bureaucracy, but I do see many people hiring individuals to help them along the way and to kind of smooth out those bumps in the road. So is it doable to live in a country like Portugal without the language? No. Without being able to be fluent in the language, yeah. But again, this gets back to what I was saying before, that if I'm moving to a country, if I'm living in a country, if I'm experiencing what it is like to actually be there, yes, I would like to be able to try to speak the language and have that experience. And when you start learning another language, you start understanding the world in a different way. And the way that people express themselves in another language has a different logic sometimes than what you might be used to. And it can help you get a better understanding of another point of view from the opposite side of the world, maybe. So that is one thing that if I do want to be able to try and speak some Portuguese here, I have that ability. But for those times where my brain really just can't handle another language, then maybe I can ask, Desculpa, o senhor fala inglês? Excuse me, sir, do you speak English? Especially if it's to do with subject matter that I'm maybe a bit less familiar with. But my Portuguese, since I've lived here, has improved quite a bit, and especially because I did have a little bit of a base already. But since moving here, I've been telling myself, okay, time to finally take a class. But with my schedule and the way that my work goes, I can't always have the same time available every week. And being able to do an online class, to plan it ahead, it ends up introducing some difficulty. So one trick that I've done that a lot of people laugh about when I've told them about it, but for me it actually has worked really well, is if I have to take an Uber, I'll try and make a point of making conversation with the driver, especially like with Uber or Bolt, whatever. Sometimes these apps tell you the country of origin of the person or something about the person. And maybe based on that, like, you can try to strike up a conversation of something. Oh, so where are you from? Or have you been in Braga long? Or this or that or the other. And actually doing that has been a way for me to really expand my vocabulary. It's not that I take Ubers so often, but for the times that I do, maybe a couple times a month that I will jump in one, it's been a great way to at least have a forced interaction and really pushing myself to try to make it happen. Granted, of course, not all the drivers here are local or from here originally, even if they live here locally. You do have many Brazilian drivers here, and a city like Lisbon, you'll find drivers who might not necessarily even be Portuguese speakers to begin with. Granted, you'll find some, but my few experiences with drivers in Lisbon have been more to the point that they ask me if I speak English rather than if they speak Portuguese. So that was actually a bit surprising to me. There are a lot of wonderful things about living in this country, but as I've said so many times in the last few weeks, there are more and more reasons that make me wonder if this is the ideal place for expats to continue to call home. As I've said a number of times, I have a more and more difficult time being able to recommend the country for individuals who are maybe a little bit newer at expat life and newer to this kind of way of living. But is it doable for individuals who are maybe a little bit late to the game, especially with some of the tax benefits and things? Yes. However, there are some major considerations to take into account, especially taxes. I'm Rafael Di Furia. This has been another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Of course, a huge thank you to those of you who helped to make these episodes possible on a monthly basis at rafaeldifuria.com/Patreon, patreon.com/RafaelDiFuria, as well as the thanks button here on YouTube. And a huge thank you to those of you who like, share, and are subscribed to this YouTube channel. Of course, stay safe and healthy out there. I'm Rafael Di Furia. This has been another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, and I'll see you all next time. Later.